I'm very lucky because she said it takes her 43 minutes, so I have no time left to say too many stupid things. But I got someone who printed out a 16-page CV, and I didn't want to read it all, but at least mention that she did her MA, first degree at Yale University. I don't want to date you, but it's 74, so you may not have been 15 at that time. And then you did also a little visit in Boston College in education, and you did an MA at Harvard University and your PhD in 91 at Harvard. So I think in far as this is concerned, you did all the right things. And when I look at your list of publication, I have nothing to say. I'm just breathless. So is there anyone who wants to have that CV? I'll give it to you. So please,
Thank you.
Margaret, go ahead. You pass that?
Okay. Muito obrigada. Gostaria de começar por agradecer à Universidade de Trás-os-Montes e Alto Douro pela sua generosa hospitalidade no patrocínio desta conferência. Especialmente aos professores Carlos Assunção, Maria Helena Pessoa Santos e Gonçalo Fernandes, bem como a toda a comissão organizadora de ICHoLS XIII. Estamos todos ansiosos por dar início a 5 dias de diálogos estimulantes nesta bela e graciosa região do norte de Portugal. That was the difficult part of my talk. I would like to add my personal thanks also to Professor Kerner, both for his introduction and for his unstinting 40 years of leadership as an editor, author, and organizer. This presentation calls attention to the status of the study of the history of language sciences in the United States, where for complex sociopolitical reasons the discipline isn't fully developed. The history of linguistics does have some presence in higher education, but what is it that we talk about when we talk about the history of linguistics? My particular concern is with students, what modern students of linguistics are told about earlier study of language and what they take away from that discussion. In 2008, I carried out a survey that investigated what American students of linguistics know about the history of linguistics. My goal was to make an assessment of both what students recognize as the historical background to the language sciences and whether they value that information and perceive it as relevant. 126 students of linguistics participated, and number 1 on your handout gives you more information about them. Roughly about a third were registered as bachelor's degree students, about a third were in MA programs, and about a third were in doctoral programs. Most were well advanced in their studies, and most identified linguistics as their major field. Their mean age was 24 years, and 71% of them were female. I conducted this study online as a 54-item anonymous voluntary questionnaire posted on the websites of 5 departments of linguistics and then enlarged by snowball sampling. This figure shows the distribution of the respondents' institutional affiliations. Roughly equal numbers of students contributed from Indiana University, Georgetown, Illinois, Boston College, and Texas. A number of U.S. students with other affiliations also participated, as did some outside the U.S., principally students at Newcastle University in the UK. The responses from students abroad were not dramatically different from those of students in the U.S. in the part of the survey that I'll tell you about today. One part of the survey asked students to communicate their orientations to the history of linguistics by reporting what role it has in their own current work. Participants were presented with 6 multiple-choice responses, deriving from an open-ended interview I conducted as a pilot test for this survey. The exact texts of the response options are given to you on your handout. The most common self-reported orientation was that, quote, "I am curious about the history of linguistics, but I don't know whether it is really worth pursuing." Thanks. Only 10% of the students considered the history of linguistics irrelevant to their research. So this question seemed to show that students have an openness to the history of linguistics, but they're unsure about its value. In addition, I investigated the curricular status of the history of linguistics. The vast majority of students had never taken a course on this topic. I asked participants to describe the historical content of any recent course that they had taken. The most common response was that occasional references to earlier language science turned up incidentally in the course, and only about a quarter of the students claimed to have taken a course with substantial historical content. In another section of the survey, I tried to understand who modern US students of linguistics recognize as historically important figures. I trolled the indices of Robins 1967, Kerner and Asher 1995, and Surin 1998 to assemble a list of 44 language scholars. Then, listing those names in chronologically random order, I asked participants to sort them into 3 groups. First, figures that they had never heard of, about which they knew nothing. And secondly, those whose names they recognized, at least vaguely, but they could not articulate what that person had contributed to the history of linguistics. And third, figures whom they could confidently identify. For any figure that fell into the latter, fully identifiable group, I asked participants to supply a sentence or two describing that person's contributions. Here are the results overall. 19 of the 44 figures were completely unidentifiable to 70% or more of the respondents. Only 4 of the 44 people were accurately identified by that same percentage of students. And the remainder of the 44 figures were only vaguely familiar to students, or at least those figures' roles in the history of linguistics was obscure to them. So in other words, most students identified just 4 of these scholars. They knew nothing about 40% of them, and for the rest, most students recognized their names but couldn't place them in the history of linguistics. That's very interesting. We'll take a short break. All right. So you recall I was telling you the results of this study, which kind of look like this, which is to say, to most American students, the history of linguistics looks like this: a hall of unknown people, an uninhabited and empty space where some statues are on display, but they're not identifiable, their purpose isn't clear, and even the labels on the statues aren't really clear to students. Let me show you the 19 largely unrecognized figures. Here are 4 of them from a very long time ago. And the number in red gives the percentage of participants in my study who did not recognize their names at all. So 93% of US students of linguistics have no idea who Donatus was, likewise 90% for Varro. Here are 4 from the 17th and 18th centuries, identifiable only by small minorities of American students of linguistics. The 19th into 20th century language scholars are likewise largely unrecognizable, so that 83% of students have no clue who, for example, William Dwight Whitney was. And this goes on even into the 20th century. Recall, however, that there were 4 individuals out of the 44 who participants in this survey were fully competent to identify, and one of those stood out, not surprisingly, Noam Chomsky, whom 97% of the students could identify accurately. Then Saussure, Labov, and Sapir are bunched closely together. There were only 3 more scholars who were recognized by more than half of the respondents in this survey. And I would speculate from the identity of these three that if you yourself want to be remembered by students in the future, make sure to have some neurological state or principle or maxim named in your honor. Finally, here's a sample of the scholars whom many modern students of linguistics can vaguely recognize, but whose contributions to the language sciences they cannot define. This category of response subsumes both historical figures like Plato and Aristotle, whose importance in other fields students are familiar with, but whose specific role in the study of language is unknown. And it subsumes figures like Max Muller or Bloomfield, about whom students may have heard a passing comment, but that comment was not consequential enough for students to remember. I would add that the focus in this part of the survey on people was pragmatically motivated. I don't know if I could have come to a different conclusions if, instead of people, I asked students to identify terms or themes in the history of linguistics, like glottochronology, or debate about the origin of language, or analogy versus anomaly. I suspect that students would have been more equivocal and less decisive in identifying themes relative to people. But granted that this was a long, voluntary, and rather taxing survey, I chose to count people as tokens of historical expertise. What I found most meaningful in my results is encapsulated in this singular, most popular response to the question probing students' orientation. Recall that about a third of them claimed that they were curious about the history of linguistics, but they lacked confidence that it was worth pursuing. I find this stance rather plaintive, as if American students do privately wonder about the sources and development of ideas and findings in their field of study, but they're unclear about whether those are legitimate questions to ask or whether their curiosity itself is sanctioned. So after carrying out this study, I decided to investigate factors that may undermine students' curiosity. Surely, general American pseudo-patriotic ahistoricity plays a role here, but I suspect that it is also supported by the specifics of higher education in linguistics. I turned then to look at materials used to teach linguistics, trying to understand whether this supported or undermined students' curiosity, and whether those materials gave students reasons to value the pursuit of historical understanding. I started with textbooks, since they are an easy point of entry into education in linguistics, and because virtually all U.S. students start their study with a survey course that relies on a textbook. I worked with books explicitly designed to introduce linguistics to complete beginners. That is, books which typically cover what the author considers the basic terms and ideas, the essential subfields, and the successes, sometimes the applications, of the language sciences. I limited my database to books marketed to American university students written by US-based scholars in roughly the past 60 years. And on your handout, number 2 lists these 21 books. You will notice in the far right-hand corner on the handout records the numbers of copies held in libraries worldwide. But I have kind of grayed those numbers out, since they are in part products of factors like the general waxing and waning of publishing trends and the vicissitudes of library budgets. Probably the numbers of editions that have been published of each book is a better, if still crude, measure of comparative success. I examined these books, some in multiple editions, for their representation of the history of linguistics. I tried to assess what role, if any, authors assign to the history of linguistics. I scrutinized the language that they used to do so. And I tried to read between the lines to determine what kind of value invested in earlier language scholarship the authors implicitly transmitted to their readers. These questions, of course, opened up all kinds of complexities. For example, what counts as earlier language scholarship? I decided to look for references to the study of language from at least one generation ago, defined as 30 years earlier. I also had to look for what was not referred to, that is, look for where an author could have, but chose not to, provide a historical dimension to the topic at hand. And I had to keep in mind that competition for space in any book is high, so that authors have to choose what information to privilege from among many candidates. But of course, the outcome of that competition strikes close to my interest. If and when authors privilege the history of linguistics, what kind of messages do they present to beginners? Working through these complexities, I found 4 recognizable conventions that textbook authors adopted. Some authors completely or almost completely masked the history of linguistics. Others infused their text with discontinuous references to the history of linguistics here and there. Some did so sparsely, some did so profusely. Still others segregated a historical account of language study into a separate section in their text. And finally, a few used the history of linguistics as a basic organizing principle. Since at every step an author can make an independent decision to include or exclude historical material, I'm oversimplifying what might be better conceived not as a taxonomy of 4 discrete categories, but rather as a scatter plot with 4 areas of greater density of observation. Nevertheless, let me walk you through examples of each of these 4 categories, representing 4 semi-autonomous ways of talking about the history of linguistics. This first group contains texts with minimal, if any, acknowledgement of the history of linguistics. Notice that the earliest one in my sample was first published in 1955 and the latest in 1996, spanning almost the full interval I am working with here. This group also included books such as those by Traeger and by Napoli, which seem not to have been publishing successes, and Finnegan's textbook, issued in 7 editions spanning 26 years. Let me show you an example of what seems like an author's willful obliviousness to the history of linguistics, taken from Gleason's 1955 textbook, in a passage that introduces readers to the notion of phoneme. Gleason begins with the notion of a basic element of sound. He counts 46 of them in English, then analogizes phonemes to elements in chemistry. He asserts that the phoneme is hard to define and warns readers that the working definition he gives here will be refined later on in the text. Notice that nowhere here or later, when Gleason elaborates on the term, does he acknowledge a historical dimension to the concept of phoneme. Rather, all the verbs are in the present indicative, as if the phoneme does now and has always existed for all students of language. As Gleason incrementally refines the definition of the term, he sustains that treatment of it, as if the phoneme were some kind of timeless natural phenomenon. We know that this is not the case. Rather, the concept of phoneme developed, gave rise to considerable controversy, and has been vigorously debated. But Gleason suppresses any evidence of controversy. He offers his readers a wholly untroubled, consistent version of this key term. Here's another example from Hockett's influential Course in Modern Linguistics. In a chapter on the comparative method, Hockett introduces parts of Werner's law, but notice that he does so as if it were given by nature, or at least as if those relationships between consonants have always been obvious to all language scholars. Werner is nowhere mentioned, nor is the fact that this pattern correspondence was a discovery made at a particular time and place, that gained stature under particular institutional circumstances, due to the agency of particular people, and so on. Finnegan gives a similar treatment to the International Phonetic Alphabet, which, as he writes, using present tense, attempts to provide a unique representation of every sound, and which is created and updated by the International Phonetic Association. That association does, of course, still exist and continues its mission. But Finnegan misses a chance to indicate that it came out of a specific transnational European context to meet the specific needs of that time and place, and has evolved for more than 125 years to date. Although nowhere does Finnegan deny that the IPA has a past, his choice to represent it as if everything relevant about it exists right now flattens an intrinsically curved space, and I suspect diverts readers away from wondering whether IPA and the association that promotes it does in fact have a past worth investigating. Overall, then, textbooks that virtually erase the history of linguistics have these traits. They dissociate terms and concepts from their historical contexts. They downplay debates and controversies. And as a result, they portray the field as essentially static. I move now to what turned up to be the most popular convention for dealing with the history of linguistics in my sample of textbooks, in which authors, as they saw fit, sporadically cited historical events, referred to earlier language scholars, or otherwise infused historical content here and there in their texts. For some authors, this amounted to a substantial, if discontinuous, presence of historical material. For others, the overall investment was slight. I will focus on a single text under this crowded rubric, Victoria Fromkin and Robert Rodman's An Introduction to Language, which is the best-selling, most republished member of the genre, in print continuously for 40 years. It has been revised and reissued 10 times, and moreover has international scope with Canadian and Philippine editions, as well as numerous translations. Textbooks in the scattered references group seem to share these characteristics. I found that historical material is often positioned in epigraphs outside the boundaries of a text proper, for example, following subsection headings or at chapter breaks. That material is rarely developed enough to count as a narrative. It is, of course, famously an object of debate whether packaging historical events into narratives is a responsible historiographical move. But these textbooks simply don't posit relationships among events or sustain a sequence of events long enough to count as wading into that debate. As a third trait of these books is that when historical material is inserted into running text, it is generally employed for one or two purposes, either to establish a precedent for modern ideas or to assert their novelty. The 6th edition of Fromkin and Rodman exemplifies these features. Immediately under a subsection heading entitled Stages of Language Acquisition, fairly late in the book, a passage is reproduced from Augustine's famous recollection of learning to speak. Fromkin and Rodman do not advert to Augustine's text or offer any analysis of it. It just sits in this prominent position, staring unblinkingly at the reader. As many have noted, this is a particularly shocking passage in Augustine's Confessions without precedent. No one would write about this topic, and certainly not in this way, in the voice of a child, for a long time. But Fromkin and Rodman incorporate it into their text without comment, as if its apparent modernity can be taken for granted. Moreover, it is worth noting that they chose to enhance that apparent modernity by strategically introducing ellipses, some of which conceal Augustine's second-person address to God. This was probably motivated by a drive to sanitize the text for a modern secular readership. But the effect is to remove another layer of challenge that a modern reader would have to confront. Fromkin and Rodman make the past artificially safe for us 21st century readers. And by hanging this text up as an epigraph, they avoid having to talk back to it or even to talk about it. I'd like to illustrate another facet of the scattered references approach from this same textbook. Early on, Fromkin and Rodman contrast descriptivism versus prescriptivism. They start with descriptivism. Without explicitly associating it with any historical interval, they tie descriptivism to modern arguments for the essential equality of all human languages and make it clear that their text adopts a descriptive approach. They then introduce prescriptivism, citing examples from the 1st through 20th centuries. The most developed example is Robert Lowe's paradigmatically prescriptive 1762 grammar, whose arguments against double negatives Fromkin and Rodman criticize. The unarticulated implication is that prescriptivism is a vestige from earlier ideas about language, perversely retained in some corners of the 20th century. But then a few pages later, Fromkin and Rodman quote in passing a 1784 grammar by John Fell, quote, "It is the business of the grammarian to find out, not to make the laws of a language." Fromkin and Rodman read this passage as a warrant for the notion of language universals and as evidence that Fell was a descriptivist ahead of his time. Still later, Fromkin and Rodman approvingly cite Samuel Johnson's 1755 dictionary as having anticipated modern descriptivism. What's missing from this tableau is any discussion of why, in the cases of Fell and Johnson, descriptivism would seem to intrude into the otherwise prescriptivist 18th century, or why prescriptivism would persist in some corners past the full daylight of 20th century descriptivism. It's unsatisfying to conceptualize descriptive versus prescriptive simply as modern versus outdated stances, concealing the sustained tension between the two. Without addressing those issues, Fromkin and Rodman's references to Fell and Johnson seem largely opportunistic. Those references don't really help students understand 18th century language study. They only glamorize 20th century language study. A third convention for representing the history of linguistics in textbooks is to segregate an independent chapter or section that presents information about the history of the field. Textbooks that take this approach vary in the extent of attention they give to the history of linguistics from 2 to 39 pages in my sample. It is characteristic of these texts to adopt a noticeably teleological attitude, as if something in this style of organization leads authors to conceive of the history of linguistics as a protracted search that has finally culminated in the modern shape of the field. Moreover, for those of these texts published after 1966, that stance shows a strong influence of Noam Chomsky's Cartesian linguistics. In addition, these texts sometimes, in an offhand way, undercut the value they would seem to invest in the history of linguistics. An example of how a textbook that dedicates a section to the history of linguistics may nevertheless undercut that investment is Dwight Bollinger's Aspects of Language. It's over there on your right. 3 editions of this text have appeared. However, only the first 1968 edition has a separate 34-page chapter, The Evolving Approaches to Language. All that material was dropped without explanation or commentary in the 1975 second edition and in the 1981 third edition. Grover Hudson's 1999 Essential Introductory Linguistics, on your left, undercuts its investment in the history of linguistics in a different way. In the preface, Hudson obligingly suggests how his 500-page text might be shortened to accommodate a cramped syllabus. He writes, quote, "No doubt many teachers will choose to omit the chapter on the history of linguistics." The teleological stance that I found to prevail in these texts is not unique to them, but it is nevertheless striking. Hughes, for example, walks readers patiently through the ancient world, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, but then turns around to depict all that came before 1786 as, quote, centuries of fumbling. One can hardly deny that there has been fumbling as scholars grapple with human language, but it didn't stop in 1786. Even after the advent of modern, highly professional linguistics, projects still get abandoned, ideas are not always clearly articulated, and recalcitrant data keep multiplying. Dwight Bollinger displays a teleological stance in a different manner. He dismisses what he calls traditional grammar on the grounds that it was, quote, neither empirical nor experimental, a standard that can hardly be held against the 14th and 15th century grammarians whom he cites. Probably not coincidentally, 4 of these 5 textbooks, all the ones published after Cartesian linguistics, offer versions of the history of linguistics informed by Chomsky's historiography. On the left side of this slide, in 1 above the dotted line, I list some of the major themes of Cartesian linguistics, such as the contrast between rationalism and empiricism, critique of Bloomfield's behaviorism, and the depiction of generative grammar as revolutionary. In 2, below the dotted line, I've added a few topics in the history of linguistics that Chomsky does not happen to discuss or discusses in only a cursory manner. In the columns on the right, I indicate the extent to which Chomskyan themes are present in 1 or absent in 2 in each of these 4 texts. My conclusion is that all 4 texts follow Chomsky's footsteps closely. Hudson's longer treatment makes room for some material that Chomsky plays down, but he adds this without challenging the basic premises of Cartesian linguistics. Finally, there is a 4th convention for representing the history of linguistics in textbooks. An author can use it as a basic organizing principle, and only 2 such textbooks, but maybe actually only 1, emerged in my sample, but they're worth examining individually. Charles Free's text reprints as a monograph what had been written as Chapter 2 of his earlier book, Linguistics and Reading. Free's preface states that his intention in publishing this material separately was to repurpose it as an introduction to linguistics. Therefore, the book's origins distinguish it from the rest of this cohort, even as its author conceived it as commensurable to the other 20 books. Free's table of contents indicates that he starts in 1820 and ends in with 1960s generative grammar. The text shows some of the influence of having been originally composed for an audience of teachers of reading, in that Frees emphasizes how, during the 140-year interval he covers, language scholars repeatedly discovered complexity in every facet of language, and systematicity in language change and in ordinary speech. In this sense, Frees introduces the basic tools and terms of linguistics in their historical contexts as a means of impressing future teachers with the complexity and systematicity of language. This distinguishes his text from the others examined here, while still demonstrating one way an author could infuse historical consciousness into an introductory course in linguistics. Francis P. Deneen's An Introduction to General Linguistics is squarely a member of the 4th category of textbooks. It is designed as a full-year introduction to linguistics and organized into 3 parts. The first of the 3 parts on the left of this slide lays down, in that Deneen lays down some elementary assumptions and vocabulary for beginners. The second part, comprising almost 80% of the text, consists of a chronologically organized review of Western language study. Starting with Saussure, he carried that forward through a series of case studies of individual figures: Saussure, Sapir, Bloomfield, Firth, Helmsleb, Chomsky. Deneen concludes with a single chapter of summary in which he studiously does not overextend. He warns, for example, that some linguistic systems were seen as autonomous, others as interrelated, and, quote, not all linguists agree in their conception of how these systems are related. Deneen's text isn't an introduction to the history of linguistics. It's what he calls a cultural introduction to linguistics. That is, an introduction to the field that infuses historical consciousness at every step. In his preface, Deneen argues for the value of this approach on 3 grounds. First, he claims that ahistoric or acultural texts fail to describe how modern linguistic techniques developed and what their advantages are, concealing the fact that, as he puts it, all positions are also counterpositions. Second, historical expertise helps a reader grasp the boundaries of the field, what it is, what it isn't, what it has been, what it hasn't been. And third, Deneen asserts that a historical cultural approach reveals the compatibility of modern scientific linguistics with traditional humanism. Deneen's case for bringing historical content into the study of linguistics right from the start might be debated, as might the success of his book in delivering those values. But perhaps together with Frees, he shows that an introductory textbook can aim to address students' curiosity about the history of linguistics. Neither book, however, was republished, and there is little evidence that either had very wide influence. Whatever success or failure met his efforts, Deneen seems to have been interested in the phenomenon of introductory textbooks in linguistics. The 1974 issue of the Georgetown University Roundtable Proceedings, which Deneen edited, includes 4 essays on exactly that topic. 3 of the authors wrote books that we have just discussed, Fromkin, Gleason, and Langaker. The 4th essay was by R.H. Robins. Perhaps the most provocative contribution is that by Fromkin, entitled Elementary Texts or Explaining the Explanation. Fromkin's essay sketches some ideals that textbooks should strive to meet in terms echoed by many of our authors, such as engaging the students in actually doing linguistics rather than just reading about it. In addition, she argues for including historical material in introductory texts on the grounds that to do so invites writers and readers to, quote, feel part of a historical tradition, and that it shows earlier language scholars were concerned with the same kinds of questions which concern us today. As part of her case for informing students about the history of linguistics, Fromkin quotes Thomas Kuhn's remarks on the historical content of science textbooks. Recall that 1974 was near the heyday of controversy about Kuhn's relevance to linguistics. Fromkin quotes verbatim this paragraph from Kuhn's text, which seems to characterize 2 of our 4 conventions typically used in linguistic textbooks, the scattered reference convention and the separate section convention. But strangely, Fromkin misrepresents Kuhn as endorsing precisely what he is criticizing. Fromkin apparently does not notice Kuhn's adjacent commentary on those conventions, namely that they, quote, truncate a scientist's sense of his discipline's history, that they lead readers to feel that they participate in a tradition that in fact does not exist, and that they present a distorted continuity of fixed problems and fixed canons. Leaving open the question of whether it makes sense to extend Kuhn's claims to linguistics, it is striking how blithely Fromkin bends Kuhn's text in her own direction, in a way not unlike her treatment of Augustine or of the history of Descriptive Ism versus Prescriptive Ism. Fromkin's support for introducing students to the history of linguistics is therefore a mixed blessing, leaving one unclear what she is talking about when she talks about the history of linguistics. But Fromkin and Rodman's textbook, though influential, is only one member of the genre. I have tried here to understand American students' general orientation to the history of linguistics by looking at how textbooks used in their first formative encounter with the study of language represent the history of linguistics. I found that, speaking from the point of view of the United States, we sometimes almost completely sublimate the history of linguistics. Or we may introduce historical material as if it inevitably culminates our current preoccupations, lending the modern discipline either a gracious precedent or a sparkling novelty. But it is rare for textbooks to risk exposing students to messiness or complexity in language study, or evidence that either in the past or now there is contradiction, discontinuity, or failure. I think this last point is particularly disabling. Insofar as modern students of linguistics are uninformed about the history of linguistics, they miss opportunities to observe how the experiences of earlier language scholars resemble their own experiences, in the sense that, like a huge oak tree, which produces hundreds of acorns, students' own perceptions of language and their ideas and questions are abundant, diverse, some promising, some doomed, so that out of this liberal over-endowment, only occasionally does an idea or observation survive, distinguish itself, and become the basis for the organism to move forward. That whole phenomenon, encompassing generous numbers of failures and dead ends, and a rare success, is, I think, worth acknowledging and analyzing with students, since they are often surprised to see it sanctioned as a part of intellectual life. However, in my experience, even when complexity and disorder is masked out of textbook representations of earlier language study, students are still open to recognizing it. Exposure to the history of linguistics helps students in their own struggles to do creative work, and it predisposes them to better tolerate ambiguity. Happily, there is reason to believe that many students harbor genuine curiosity and openness towards precisely the kind of scholarship that will be displayed in abundance this week at this conference at ICHoLS XIII. Thank you.
Well, just a moment, if I may. The organizers asked me to present Margaret with a nice statement saying that, in fact, you did prepare a nice presentation. And
well, thank you so much. Do we have a minute for questions, if there are any?
Normally, plenary lectures are not open for discussion, but if there is a demand for it, I think I'm ready for it myself. What about you?
I think we have a minute or two, right?
Yeah? So if there's a question, please don't be shy.
Thank you. I have a comment. Margaret, thank you very much for your survey. And maybe you could eventually give us a hint. What do you think that us in South and North America could still do to improve or to change a bit the situation?
Well, perhaps write different books, talk to your students in different ways. How many people in this room teach a course, an introductory course in linguistics? A few do. Well, I feel that those people are on the vanguard of helping students recognize the value of their curiosity. So I think that your own work would be of value to them.
Thank you, first of all, for what you told us. I consider that the summary of the... Can you hear me? All thanks. The summary of the handbook you quoted, which had just a chapter about structural linguistics in the States, provoked my attention to the temptation perhaps each of us has of considering just our place in the world, considering that structuralism didn't, as far as I know, come just from that time in the States, but had a European history and a rather varied European roots, not only Geneva and Saussure, but Prague and Copenhagen and so on. So, I mean, the last hint you gave us, history compels us in a way to face efforts, success and failures. I mean, it's more complex the way we come out, and how happy is the opportunity of showing how many different enterprises appears on the face of the earth, and even far from ourselves cooperate to develop a theory and discoveries. And so I do think this, in a way, has to face with the difference between the state of the art of natural sciences and of humanities. This idea of not cumulating only, and of dialogue between different traditions and languages and countries. I think this is so important. What do you think?
Thank you for that comment. I couldn't agree more. And as we were heard this morning, we're from 30 different countries and 5 continents here, so we can be a dynamo of that experience in the next week. Thank you.
And who wants this full CV of our speaker? No another question? Where?
Thanks, Margaret. My question is really a question for a change. and that is, most of your analysis had to do with the relationship between the history of linguistics and the teaching of linguistics. And I think that in itself is an interesting problem to take on. Looking at, if you go back post-World War II to the present, we're talking about changes, right, in the pedagogy of linguistics itself, whether it be in North America or in Europe or wherever. So that the textbooks, to some extent, may be both in line with those changes, and Pierre was talking about that just a moment ago, but also maybe reflecting, in a sense, the tensions that were going on with respect to those pedagogies. So one is, my first part of it is can you respond to that aspect of it, the relationship between the changing pedagogies themselves? And the second part is a corollary to that, which is, but that's only the teaching of linguistics, and it's only within the context of the disciplinary history of linguistics per se. And I think one of the main problems is that if you could make the same argument for historiography itself, which never addresses many times the very nature of historiography, its own history, and its own and doesn't move it into the history of ideas per se. So what about what is your take on maintaining a disciplinary approach to the history of linguistics, or jettisoning that entirely and moving into the history of ideas into broader cultural history?
Well, that's a very tempting open door, but it's rather too broad a door for me to walk through, or for this paper to have addressed. But a facet of that I have looked a little bit into is the changing nature of college students themselves and what their expectation, who is in those classes, and what their expectations are for sort of why they're in the classes and what they're doing there. And that has changed exactly during this period as well, having a huge influence on higher education. I know that you've studied pedagogy over the years, so probably you're better equipped to understand that than anyone else in this room.